Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we are talking about the upcoming launch, and probable launch actually, given when this will go out, of the new TA6 Property Information Form, the 6th edition of this form, and listeners to the podcast will be well aware of some of the furore that surrounded the 5th edition and what ultimately happened around the Law Society consultation, and where we're up to. So the 6th edition is the output of all of that work. I'm delighted today to be joined by Sarah Sargent, Head of Residential Conveyancing in the Yorkshire region of Flint Bishop. Great to have you on the podcast, Sarah. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to talk about the time and energy that goes into the protocol forms. I'm not sure that conveyancers really fully appreciate that. I was chatting to now or soon to be president of the Law Society, Mark Evans, at a conference last year, and he said, do you have any idea how much time goes into these forms? And I said, I really don't. So what I'm hoping, Sarah, today is to get a bit of insight into some of that investment from a practitioner's point of view. Before we launch into that, though, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do?
So, as you said, I'm a qualified solicitor working in residential property. I've been involved now in that industry for just over 20 years. So I run a team here in Yorkshire, specialising in all aspects of residential property transactions. And I have been involved with then the Law Society for about the past 10 years in various ways. And I was then brought on to this project to come up with the 6th edition towards the back end of last year, after everything had, the furore that we'd had with the 5th edition. I was asked if I would like to get on board with the 6th edition because I am, heavily involved in day-to-day practice. So that's where my background in this lies.
If ever I've heard of a poison chalice, that sounds like it might be it. What on earth possessed you to sign up for that?
So I had been asked to speak last year at the SGM in relation to material information and the impact that it would have on the industry. And I had seen huge benefits in some of what was coming through from the 5th edition. And I have also personally been pushing for more upfront information in the industry for a number of years now. I've always been able to see the benefits of how upfront information will help in the process. So there was a lot that had come in on the 5th edition that I was a proponent for and actually embraced. That's not to say that I didn't see where some of the issues were with this. So when there was the furore on the 5th edition, I was keen to actually be part of a process that we could review and improve, because I think it was important that the work from that wasn't just thrown away, because it is important that as an industry we do keep moving forwards and that we do keep looking at how we can improve the process. So I wanted to make sure that we looked at the form carefully and we listened to the views, and also I could bring my own experience as a practitioner. And I was confident that we could get the forms to a point which actually would be embraced.
Well, the timing of our podcast is rather fortuitous because we're speaking on the day that the government has launched its home buying and selling consultations, of which one is the inclusion of material information at an earlier stage in the transaction. But let me take you back to that halcyon summer of 2024 when the fifth edition is released and there's this real uproar around it, isn't there? Did you have empathy at the time for the conveyancers that really sort of were set against this introduction of more information to be thrown at conveyancers who are already dealing with so much in the transaction?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I am a practitioner. I am on the tools, as it were. And I, of course, had empathy with that. As I say, I wasn't involved in the fifth edition. So I came to the fifth edition as everybody else in the industry did, seeing the document that was presented, reviewing that, and approaching it with a degree of trepidation, as I think all did. Change is always hard, change is difficult, and the fourth edition of the form had been around for so long, and a lot of what we do as practitioners is process, is muscle memory, is familiarity. And I think anything that does change that will always make people nervous around it. And we are now in a world where we are cautious about anything which we feel may put any greater degree of risk or obligations on us as conveyancers, because we have had so much placed on us. So I totally empathise with how the industry received those changes and amendments on the fifth edition.
And you obviously joined the committee thereafter, or that you seconded onto the committee. What was the attitude of the committee at that point in time? Because I can imagine that it must be very frustrating to be a member of the committee that's put so much time and energy into creating this update that that ultimately is very largely rejected by the profession.
Yeah, I think for those that were part of that previous, I think that that is difficult because, as you say, there is a huge amount of time that's put into this. I mean, if I can just at this point, talk about where we've taken the sixth edition to. I started work on this in November of last year, so November 2024. And I have had weekly meetings since that point with the group where we have analysed the consultation, we have analysed members' views, we've analysed the form to absolute, sort of minute degrees, and really sort of looked at what our members had said to us, and also for those of us that are in the group who are practitioners, from what our day-to-day experience of it is. I mean, I can't do the maths on it that quickly, I'm afraid, to say the number of hours that have gone in, but as you say, we're coming up to close to 12 months, as I say, of weekly meetings, which have, sometimes extended to, 2 hours at a time.
Yeah.
And yeah, it has been analysed to an incredible extent. So I think, there is no doubt that it is sometimes disappointing when we hear that the members don't think that thought has gone into these forms, because I can assure you that a huge amount of thought and consideration is placed into the forms. And as you've just touched upon, at the moment, we are dealing with an ever-changing vista on this, from one day to the next almost, of what we're being told that has to be there. And material information is not going away, as we've seen today. But it's evolving, and it's difficult to try and keep pace with that at the moment.
And just to sort of rewind a touch to your point about the expertise that's gone into the form and the expertise on the committee. I mean, and criticism that the people on the committee aren't practitioners. I mean, that, again, sort of wrong, really, isn't it? Because people on the committee are practitioners. There is a real wealth of knowledge and understanding of conveyancing on there.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely, and I would like to quite, sort of go against that and be quite strong on that. There are 11 members actually now, the majority of which on the working group, and that's, as I say, it's 11 members of the working group, and the majority of them are residential practitioners from various guises, from sort of larger firms like myself to to sole practitioners, to sort of some of the big firms in London, to regional practices. We do have a really good mix there to represent. Yeah, anybody who says that the working group is made up of people who are out of touch or are not not aware of the challenges, it's simply not true. It's definitely not true of the 6th edition anyway, I can assure you of that.
Pretty strong words. Let me I don't know how much you could sort of explore around some of the content of the consultation and how that's influenced your direction of travel. But
yeah,
there's a sense that the loudest voices, I suppose, the dissenters on the 5th edition certainly made their voice heard, and there was a lot of polarization of opinion. As ever with these things, I suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle, isn't it? I mean, how much is that true in terms of the response to the consultation? How much was there a view that, well, actually, look, if we made some tweaks and changes, that we can make this work, that we can incorporate material information much more into the conveyancing process and get that, at an earlier stage? Or was it the case that the consultation actually was very polarized and said, no, we don't want this?
No, I would say the consultation was a much more measured approach and was extremely constructive in the conversations that we were then able to have as the working group. And the focus had not been within the form simply on material information, which was also incredibly helpful because, we made the decision quite early on with the amendments on the 6th edition that if we were to consider material information, that would be separated out in its entirety. And so that is stripped out from the 6th edition. And obviously with the announcements that have just been made, we'll have to go through a further process of consultation, listening to what the government reforms are and then listening to what our members want from that. But we did make the decision with the changes to the NCLERT guidance quite early on that actually did not need to be the main focus. And actually, when you looked at the consultation, they actually focused on more things around the practical implications of the TA6 that I believe have helped us to deliver a product which is now fit for purpose for the conveyancing moving forwards.
Well, I can't let you leave it at that. You're going to have to elaborate on what some of those practical things that came out of the consultation were, Sarah.
So I think, there's a number of them. I mean, so as a practitioner, with going back to the 4th edition, there were some things that were coming up time and time again on inquiries, which you could not say that the other side were raising non-compliant inquiries, but they were becoming a regular inquiry to bring up. So, for example, things like multi-fuel stoves. We now have a wider range of heating sources. We're no longer just interested in whether you're on gas or whether you're on oil. There are a huge number of things to consider: air source heat pumps, electric vehicle charging points. As things have moved on in the outside world, which we wanted to capture within the forms, and they are some of the things that members had raised. And so, we've gone through all of those things within this form and considered the changes that have happened in the wider world and how we can bring those into the form. And a lot of that had come out from the consultation. So they are things that members had focused in on the consultation, and that, that helped to actually frame it. And we broke down the consultation in, quite minute detail, what every question, what people had asked, and then how we applied that to the forms.
And so we are at a point in time where we've got a new edition, as you say. If we put material information to one side, and it was confirmed earlier this year that the work on that material information form had been paused in the wake of the withdrawal of the NCSELAT guidance.
Yes.
Although what happens now, we're not too sure, as you say. So what does the 6th edition look like? How does it differ from the 5th edition?
Well, there are a few things here. I mean, I think everybody will be pleased to know it is shorter. So
that's a relief.
Yeah. So the 6th editions, there are 15 sections, and there are actually 10 fewer than the previous edition. And to give you an example of what is no longer included, we are no longer asking about council tax, asking price, physical characteristics of the property, building safety, restrictive covenants, accessibility. All of those elements have been removed from the 6th edition, and I think that will be welcomed by members. We were also told during the consultation that it would be helpful if the form included more checkboxes for when the sellers didn't know an answer to a question. So we considered increasing, and which we have increased, the number of options of not known. And in addition, there are more questions phrased as, are you aware, where a no response is equivalent to not known. So we really thought about the language that we were using in these forms, and we really thought about the end user's experience. So not just the legal practitioners, but how our clients are going to approach this form and actually use the form. I also think visually, I think people are going to be, I don't think surprised is the word. They might be surprised, but I think they're going to be pleased to see that visually, the minute you look at this film, it looks different. We've had designers really look at how we use this. We've brought in some instances, infographics to help with clients completing these forms. So there's some quite significant changes in there, and it looks like a totally different form in many ways.
I've certainly heard that the language has been changed to be a little bit more what might be described as consumer friendly. I mean, this is really an effort to try and get consumers and home movers to complete the form better so that you've got more information, I suppose. But secondly, to understand their liability as well.
Yes, and as part of that, a huge amount of work has gone into the explanatory notes. So it is really important that consumers do understand their liability around this form. And, we are aware that there's been recent case law as well that, does emphasize that a consumer, they have to really know what they're talking about in this form. It's not just enough to sort of have a cursory look at the form and what you think might be correct. If you have done something to your property, then the expectation now is you should have known what you were doing with that. You should have made the checks, and you should be very clear on the form how you do that. And so we have gone to a huge effort to create a simpler form with clearer explanatory notes so that sellers can feel more confident filling it out, and also knowing when to get advice from their solicitor. Because I think that's really important, is knowing when you need to reach out and ask for a little bit more information on these things.
I don't want to get bogged down in enquiries because that's a whole other podcast, and we've done a couple on enquiries particularly. But you mentioned that some of the questions were designed to tackle some of the increasing number of issues that we have around inquiries. Do you sort of see that that work needs to continue? Do you think that it's the role of the TA6 to tackle some of the inquiries process?
I think if you go back to the protocol, the point that the TA6 is meant to be at the heart of the information provided by a seller, then yes, I think it is crucial that we maintain a review of these forms if and when there are significant changes which are leading to, the same inquiries coming through over and over again. Because, the protocol forms are meant to be, at the heart of the process. So, if they are not covering things in enough detail, then I think it is right that we do review them and consider whether they are then points which should be brought into the forms. I'll give one thing away that is coming into the form, and that is we had noticed, for example, that on the question around Japanese knotweed, it was becoming extremely common if a client had said that had answered no to Japanese knotweed specifically, that we were finding more and more that other firms were then asking if any reports had been carried out to back that up. And so to save that being a repeated inquiry that we deal with time and time again, we have brought that within the TA6. So there is now an additional question that deals with that. So they are the sort of things that we gave thought to as we were dealing with these forms.
It'd be interesting to see how that develops. My sort of personal view, and I have a lot of empathy for conveyancers on this front, because you're there to do the legal transaction. You're there to, transact title from one person to another and make sure that it's all legally binding. But there's a gap, and there's a gap for consumers who, and I've heard lots of ridiculous inquiries like paint color and where the carpets were from and all that kind of business. But the reality is that whilst that's not a legal issue, it's still something that a consumer might want to know about that property. And so, there is a gap there in terms of maybe not something quite as trivial as paint color, but making sure that consumers get that information as part of the transaction. I'm not suggesting for a moment it's the lawyer's job, though.
No, and I think we also have to appreciate the roles that each party plays in a transaction. And whilst I can see that might be, from a consumer, from a buyer, wanting to know the colour of the paint on the walls, or, whether there are any spare paint if they want to do any touch-ups post-completion. I get why a buyer might be interested in that, but it absolutely should not fall as part of the legal process. So I think this is where it's a collaborative process and it's everybody understanding their roles, because that is something that, can quite easily be dealt with between estate agents and respective clients, and also can be dealt with much more efficiently in that pathway, because an agent is the one person who can speak to both sides, both parties directly without it going through additional channels. So I think what we have to do is that education piece and signpost. So, equally, if we've got a client who's a buyer who's asking that information of us, for the industry to turn around, for us as lawyers to turn around and say, totally understand why that might be important to you. It isn't a legal point though, so we don't deal with it as solicitors. However, go away and speak to the agent and they should be able to help you with that.
Which rather serendipitously leads me on to a quick question about the material information form. You said that you separated the form out. It was paused. The work on that was paused earlier this year. We know that. And I'm not asking you to look into your crystal ball and predict the future. A consultation has been launched today on what material information might look like for property transactions. But can you give us some insight into the work that you did on that form up until the point that it was paused,
What I would say is it did get paused fairly early on in the process, to be honest. We made the decision quite early on as part of the working group that the form had to be redesigned from where the 5th edition was, because it was a little bit difficult on the 5th edition to understand where the material information part of it started and where the true sort of TA6 as we were used to began. And there were various discussions about how we could make that work, but we decided quite early on that the answer would be to remove material information and have that as a separate form. Because the idea of upfront information works, but it works when it's truly upfront. If that ship's already sailed and a sale's already been agreed, and that the property's been marketed, the sale's been agreed, and we're then getting instructed at that point, having a question about how the property is accessed, for example. Well, you've already seen the property, put an offer in. So we very quickly realised that things like that, the timing of it could change depending on the circumstance. We then focused in on what was going to be the TA6 with the intention that the material information form, we would go back to that, but then very quickly the guidance changed. So in truth, that was parked, and we didn't turn back to that because of the change in the guidance. Now, it may be that has to be picked up again in the future, and I think there needs to be a much wider discussion and consultation around the whole element of upfront information and how we improve the conveyancing process. I think everybody would agree that something needs to be done, but it's a huge topic which is going to take a lot to unravel.
Absolutely no arguments here, and it will be absolutely fascinating to see how the consultation develops and what comes out from that. We're fast moving towards the end of the podcast, and I said that I wanted to give listeners a real understanding of the time and energy that goes into this TA form, and I'm very grateful, Sarah, for you sharing some of the insight that went into it as well. But just to finish off, I know you've got some information there about just the numbers of people that have responded to the consultation. I remember we printed on today's Conveyancer, it was something like 1,200 people responded, and then the work that sort of has gone into it, so that we've got now a 6th edition that is reflective of the profession and the expertise that's gone into it.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, you've had 11 members of a working group spending roughly 2 hours a week for almost a year, poring over raw data on the consultation, which received around 1,000 responses from conveyancer members. Then in turn, you've had the work that the Law Society then put in with their designers and their teams to actually pull this together to develop the forms. And we've then taken that forwards to then create a form which has then been tested. So we've had user testing on this in June and July of this year, which has included 9 in-depth interviews with conveyancers, 12 in-depth interviews with sellers, and 12 eye-tracked usability interviews with sellers as well. And testing the form has been fundamental to helping us make sure it's both clear and logical for both the solicitors that are going to be using this and also for the clients as well, the end users. So that's been really important to us.
Well, I hope that listeners are a little more aware of what goes into the creation of the property protocol forms. I'm led to believe that there are reviews of some of the other TA forms coming up as well. But I'm very appreciative of your time and insight today, Sarah. So thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Sarah. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.